So I had.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Welcome. The talk I'm going to do today with you is building on my previous research on learner participation. Okay. My aim today is just to give you some sort of insight into my thinking on the role of silence as it relates to participation. I will give you just some basic bibliography or references. I myself have just started reading up on the topic, so it's new to me. Perhaps you might have some input or contributions you would like to make towards our understanding of silence. Okay. So why do we talk about silence, or why is there a need to talk about silence? I don't know what your teaching experience is, but I find very much in the communicative language teaching tradition, in which I grew up, and which very is highly dominated by an Anglo-Saxon understanding of communication. Silence makes us all feel a little bit unhappy or nervous or anxious, or perhaps something's wrong. Okay. Now, when we were researching language learning and learner interaction in virtual worlds, there were lots of silent moments. I don't know if anybody has experienced virtual worlds or virtual reality. The same applies to any kind of online learning platform where there is no video. So you can't see the other person. In virtual worlds, they're represented through avatars, and sometimes the avatars would go dead, meaning sometimes the avatars would stop moving. And there would be lots of reasons for this. It could be an internet connection problem. It could be the students who just stood up to get a book off a shelf. It could have been a number of explanations. What we know about learner participation in online contexts is that just because a learner is not active or not doing or not speaking doesn't mean they're not learning. Okay? That's sort of one of the basic notions we have from the literature on learner participation. When we were in virtual worlds, of course, if the students were silent, we would then have to start a number of sort of prompts to see what was going on. Do you have a technical problem? Do we need to contact you via another medium? Do we need to contact you on your phone to try and get the student some way to respond? My research on participation sort of stopped at this. Okay? So silence was usually a problem resulting in a technical issue. Silence, I'm assuming we're all from similar language teaching, language learning backgrounds. Silence in the language learning classroom can be some people a problem, because if the student isn't speaking, perhaps their competence level isn't up to the level required, or perhaps they're shy, or perhaps it's a motivation problem, or perhaps something's wrong. So we find that a quiet classroom in language learning does raise some questions which have to do with our methodology and the classroom makeup in general. As with all beliefs about learning, we all have beliefs about silence. Okay, and some of them, I don't know what your beliefs are. I've sort of seen as I progress with age, I'm a lot more tolerant of silence now than I was when I started teaching. And just together with you, I would like to discuss some of the implications, perhaps, that our assumptions about silence have on our teaching. Now, we know from the literature, this is all just a bit boring, but from the literature on participation, participation is basically defined as linguistic activity or interaction. So the students are doing something with the language. Basically, they're speaking, they're writing. According to Van Leer, second language learning is perceived as the learner's ability to engage with the environment. Okay, so language learning is about engaging with the environment. Then, you know, what does engaging with the environment mean? We can see that perhaps shortly. And then Landolf, for example, refers to participation as learner activity. Okay, so there's a strong emphasis in the literature on action, activity, doing, which means, in language learning terms, speaking. So the question then is, if the student is silent, are they non-active? Is there no interaction going on? So is the opposite, is silence the opposite of participation, or is it something different? Perhaps we could see, you know, we could see silence as a form of activity. And perhaps we can also see it as a form of interaction. And to use the term engagement that Lanier uses, perhaps silence can also be seen as a form of engagement. I'll just explain what I mean. We all know that when we're having a conversation, you can't usually have, you know, two people speaking once, though in some cultures we do have two people speaking once, but that's perhaps an extreme. Yeah? Okay. So if we're listening, we're usually silent. Silence can be seen as a way of giving space to the other person in the interaction. And we can communicate silence in a number of ways through our body language. And in this sense, silence can be described as a form of non-verbal participation. Therefore, silence is participation, but it needs to be described as non-verbal. It can be perceived because we can see when somebody is listening, paying attention, interacting with their body, eye contact. The problem the literature on silence has identified is, though, how do we measure silence? So the tradition in linguistics or in second language research is often to transcribe what the learners are saying. But how do we transcribe silence, and how do we know what that silence means? Another definition, very, very close to that of participation, perhaps some of you are familiar with it, is willingness to participate. And it is connected to cultural, political, social, identity, motivational, emotional, pedagogical, and other issues that learners face. And this is the definition by McIntyre 2020. So, would it be fair to say that silence is an indication of willingness to participate? So, should we assume that a student who is silent doesn't want to participate? And if we take that assumption with us, what are the implications for our teaching? The question is, do we want to take this assumption with us, or perhaps the reality is different? This is a slide I used last year when I was presenting teacher reflections on participation. And of course, our assumptions and our understanding of what participation means or non-participation in science will affect the materials we use, the methodology. For example, this morning we saw a talk on tandem learning. Tandem learning requires participation in science constantly. And if the students aren't aware of their role in that relationship, learning can't take place. So you need to think, is a tandem methodology appropriate for my context, for example? So our understanding of silence also impacts how we grade our students, our classroom practice, our expectations of what students need to be doing, and it is reflected in our beliefs about education, and it's a demonstration of our own willingness to engage with students. So, for example, thinking about our own silence in the classroom. Is there a role for that? Do we use it enough? So, from the literature, from the literature. Bell, for example, says, what do we know about silence? Do we know enough? And in his review of, in 2019, the suggestion he makes is that we don't know enough about silence. We know everything about interaction, turn taking, speaking, but we don't know enough about silence, and there is not much literature that documents silence in the language classroom. From a more sort of psychological perspective, Granger, 2004, talks about the silent period and silence as a psychical event. I'm sure you're all aware of how, for example, our learners, after a lot of initial activity at the beginning of the course, will start to slow down. Perhaps you've noticed that sometimes after a month or two, from the beginning of the course, students slow down and become quiet. Okay, this has been identified in language learning as the silent period. Often, I don't know from your own experiences of travelling abroad, the first 2 weeks you will speak a lot, and then suddenly it's like you sort of shut down for some time, as if our brain were processing all this new information and had to go quiet for a while. In some of the literature, and I think this is what we need to be very cautious of, though it is important that it has been documented, silence is seen as a negative. Now, Han is looking, if I remember correctly, at the situation in English language learning in Vietnam. And his research looks at how often silence is due to lack of confidence in students, also lack of self-confidence, lack of competence in the language, in the language itself, and also due to an environment which the students don't perceive as safe, protective, welcoming of mistakes. Okay. And in that context, the student not speaking is seen as something deficient with the learner, deficient in the technical sense, okay? Or there's something deficient in my teaching. However, Bao says that we can't keep on ignoring silence because it is a significant part of classroom behavior. But the problem is, how do we capture it and how do we measure it? Often, some research in silence in the foreign language classroom asks students somehow to report on their inner speech. So while you are silent, can you write down what you were thinking? Or perhaps you can just report to yourself, what are you thinking at that moment? That, of course, enables us to interpret silence to some extent, but there's a lot of silence that can't be covered just through the reporting of the speech. So King starts to talk about silence in a more positive way compared to the traditional literature, and says, yes, silence can be seen as a barrier, and we need to be aware of that, but silence can also be seen as a resource. Silence is often an indication that something is going on, and often what is going on is, we heard the opening speech this morning, deep learning. The concept of deep learning has been around for a long time. It's just now being taken over by artificial intelligence, but it did exist before artificial intelligence. So that moment in which we are processing at a profound cognitive level our learning. And Bao also argues for the potential of silence in the language classroom. Granger also goes on to talk about the relationship between silence and identity. In her particular situation, she was looking, I believe, at a migrant community, whereby not only was the learner negotiating a new language, but that new language also meant the development of a new identity. Then there's some very interesting literature. This is just one of the references that looks at silence and gender. I love the topic of this article, Shushing the Girls. Okay. This is 2003. And I'm sure a lot of you from experience, you will have noticed that perhaps in certain classrooms, in certain contexts, boys might talk less or more than girls, or vice versa. There might also be, as Julia goes on to discuss, the connection between silence and ethnicity. Oh, Max, I do that. Okay, in ethnicity and intersubjectivity. So when thinking about silence, we also need to look at the identity of our learner, which can be connected to gender. It may have nothing to do with gender, it may have something to do with culture and beliefs about education in general. So King invites us to embrace the silence in our language classrooms, and I love the term of embracing silence. And Granger goes on to talk about the importance of silent spaces between languages. So what she is suggesting is that perhaps we give greater importance and greater emphasis to those silent moments in our language. So my questions to you, your take-home questions, or you can ask me now. What is silence in your context? How do you feel about silence? Do you value it? Do you nurture it? And can you use it to enhance learning in your specific contexts?
Thank you very much indeed. You're very clear way of enunciating what you're saying. So thank you. It was a pleasure to listen.